of Alaska Fairbanks. Today on the docket we're on part 4 of the series, and so what we'll be talking about today is implementation, public outreach, and some policy discussions. We're hoping today will be a little bit more of a dialogue than the previous webinars have been. So hopefully you have mic capabilities. If not, I'm still willing to transfer questions from the question box over to Mark as we move along. So with that, I'm gonna kick it over to Mark, and we'll get this going.
Okay. You can hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I think we should probably start out with just some questions on experiences. And if we can maybe canvass the audience. And we have some people that represent public agencies. I know we have some consultants, maybe some students. But if the public agencies that are in attendance or listening in could share with us some of their experiences on implementation of roundabouts. And I'm referring to the public outreach side, development of policy, council or commission acceptance of roundabouts, and maybe share some of their experiences so we can hear firsthand what people are going through.
I know we're working on a project involving possibly a couple roundabouts here in Fairbanks, our firm. We haven't got to the public involvement stage.
What do you plan to do?
Well, we're looking at this section of highway, revitalizing, looking at repaving, realignment. And one of the big ones is we have an intersection that fails kind of on your east and west bound approaches. And so we're kind of thinking that a roundabout would be the best opportunity to help all directions achieve the level.
How are you communicating the need, and how are you engaging all of the stakeholders?
Well, that's the process we're working on right now. We're developing our DSR and the traffic report. We haven't officially sent our recommendations in the DOT yet.
Okay. Have you had any public contact where you've showed them different options?
Not necessarily for this project. We're still in the early stages. We've done more discussions with a couple businesses about the process, but no graphics have been shown. That's going to be coming up here in a couple months.
And you intend to show all possible intersection control options, benefits, pros, and cons?
Yes.
Will you have made a decision on the preferred solution at the time you make that presentation?
I think we'll have made a decision on what the preferred solution is. I feel that talking to our traffic guides, it seems that a roundabout right now, just before we've done any kind of real looking into it, but just looking at the numbers, seems that that's the best solution. At least that's what they feel.
Can you introduce yourself? We had a question of who's speaking and from what firm.
Oh, I'm Tom. I'm with Dow HKM.
Thanks, Tom. Maybe someone else? Someone that's sort of the front end of whether roundabouts should even be in the toolbox.
So our remote attendees are unmuted. I don't know if you guys got mic capabilities or not. But if you don't, just you can chime in the questions box, and I'll read those aloud.
Has anyone in the room with you, Nathan, had difficulty in public outreach with Roundabout?
Well, I can, nobody else in the room, but I can say from my experiences, when I was working on my degree back in Vermont, I went to a number of public forums and public outreach campaigns for Roundabout, some of which were successful and some of which weren't. And so the ones that, like, I guess I'll speak to the ones that tended to be more successful was once VTrans, the Vermont Department of Transportation, realized that they were having trouble getting public support for these projects, that they kind of changed gears and decided, well, we're noticing that a lot of the pushback is coming from folks in the trucking community, from the non-motorized user community, and from, I'm trying to now remember, like, the third constituent that they had on hand. But what they decided to do was to get champions from each of those quote-unquote industries. So they had Ron Bellavance, who was the owner and CEO for Bellavance Trucking in Vermont. They had Nancy Schultz, who was the president of the Vermont Bike and Ped Coalition. And again, the third one is escaping me, but so what they did was had those folks come in to these public forums, and then when somebody had, you know, pushback on that particular aspect, like, you know, a pedestrian's not going to be able to cross, or this is unsafe for bikes, or, you know, I'm a trucker and I don't like this, that these champions then came forward and said, well, you know, we're leaders in this industry, and here's why we like roundabouts, and here's why we think this is going to be good for the town, which worked great. And now, you know, Vermont has, you know, since that happened, you know, there was one prior to that strategy where they didn't have luck, and because of the, you know, the public opposition, they decided not to go with it, changed that strategy, and they got four built right back to back, all kind of in the same area, and the town was just crazy to have them come in. Maybe crazy is an exaggeration, but they were more on board than they had been previously.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Yeah, I've heard of that sort of thing. Agencies have done that with State Patrol. You know, they'll bring someone in, someone that's recognized by their peers, or at least the community. That's great. Okay. Well, we'll be able to stimulate some dialogue as we go. I think I'll stop and ask a question from time to time. But for today's session, I want to introduce some of the common pitfalls that come with public outreach and implementation, and some of the things that we haven't done so well. For instance, you know, we are good at project level public outreach, engaging the public on a project level, but we seem to have overlooked, you know, the agency level and area-wide, community-wide public engagement, and particularly the use of roundabouts as a new traffic control device or a new design form for intersections. I want to dwell on that a little bit because there might be someone in the room that has influence in that area and can affect a lot of change and acceptance at a higher level where things can really develop momentum. So let's work through some slides. This one I showed you the other day. I covered, you know, the first part, which is about design, when we talked a lot about design. But I mentioned that implementation strategy is something we've seemed to have overlooked as a community of designers, of planners, of folks who want to use roundabouts. We talked about the selection of sites in the very first session, how it's very important to demonstrate the benefits of roundabouts by solving some of your worst congestion and safety problems, because roundabouts trickle down. Agencies have, the agencies that we found have gotten into the roundabout revolution the latest are the ones who have a bottom-up approach, who want to prove the benefits of a single-lane roundabout in a subdivision before they'll go out to an interchange or a high-crash location or a rural high-speed location. It takes a long time to prove the benefits of a roundabout with almost no traffic and no risk. But if you have a severe safety problem or congestion issue, you can demonstrate the benefits of roundabouts and never look back. And that's really what got the program or the initiative of using roundabouts in North America started, because some of the first sites were some of the worst congestion and safety problems. And then we talked at I think the last session, and we'll talk again next week about sizing roundabouts, but mostly about design considerations in the last couple of sessions, and not overbuilding, especially attending to context, whether it be pedestrians, freight movement, bicycles, speed concerns, visibility, landscape. Context should be the driving force behind roundabout layout. But the part at the top where I said develop an implementation strategy, I think the thing that we've overlooked the easiest is that we tend to just follow the money, and the money follows the project, and the outreach follows the project. But what about considering this? Look at roundabouts as a new type of traffic control, as a new device or a new design form for intersections, just like a diverging diamond interchange or J-turns or super streets or some of these innovative intersection designs. They're new initiatives. While things like DDIs and other innovative intersections can tap into our knowledge of how to use intersections, our familiarity with roundabouts, or sorry, familiarity with signal heads and things like that. Roundabouts, on the other hand, there's no point of reference for the driver. Not everyone has traveled to Europe, Australia, and most of us don't have a point of reference to say, oh, I've driven a roundabout, so I can work with this new design. And the thing I think we missed in the first 10 or 15 years of roundabout work, and this is still going on today, so I bring it up as an important issue, is we equate the safety statistics on roundabouts with their ease of driving. So for reducing crashes by 50 to 80%, injuries are being reduced by 50 to 80% in motor vehicle crashes, then surely there must be some benefit to roundabouts, and they're not too difficult to drive. But I think we missed that point. And the point is driver adaptability. In our human factors textbooks, you'll see statements about the quality of an operating condition or the quality of a traffic scheme is usually dependent on two things, the quality of its design and the adaptability of the driver. So the driver interface is a big part of this solution. And where roundabouts are concerned, the method or the process or the task of gap seeking is not as easy as we think it is. It's depth and speed, perception, it's some competing sources of information, the driver looking left and seeking a gap. It's also new. So to develop habits and correct habits on yielding in entries and picking the correct lane and the combination of things that have to happen at roundabouts, I think we've taken for granted some of the education requirements and the adaptability factors for drivers. And I'll back that up with some crash statistics as well as some anecdotal evidence from a number of agencies that have gotten into 1 to 200 roundabouts plus and are only now beginning to experience a backlash or mounting resistance. Kind of like what you described, Nathan, with the freight movement or the cycling and pedestrian community. And there's ways you can address that at the project level. And I think we need to do more at the agency level. So I'm going to use that as a bit of a backdrop because that's a point of emphasis. I think we can get project level public outreach going for us. And I can share examples of where we've had a robust public level outreach or project level outreach and we never finish the meeting. It totally disintegrates into a shouting match, and the public are thoroughly upset with the idea that the agency is going to do this, and what right do they have, and our taxes are going to go up, and you can list all the possible reasons why people would object to something. But it all boils down to a couple of things, and one of them is change. That people are not so willing to change unless they equate it with benefits. It's like the cough medicine idea. One of the companies says, it tastes bad, but it's good for you. And that's hard to put those two together. But in roundabouts, it shouldn't really taste bad, and it is very good for you. And what we're missing is helping them to understand that taking a little bit of that medicine is actually going to result in safer operating conditions. So with that as a backdrop, I'll go through some of the slides, and there'll be opportunities to stop. And this is an open forum, so anyone that has a question, Nathan, please have me stop for a minute, and we'll take it up. So the backdrop for implementing roundabouts, some of the things I've mentioned is that roundabouts are not widespread, and I don't believe they're that well promoted. I think we've done a reasonable job in some cases, but there's a lot of room for improvement in public outreach. We have sometimes started with non-complex sites, so we really don't prove anything. The development of practice and standards was lacking and lagging behind the industry's initiatives, so a community of designers that love to use roundabouts and design them. It's a lot of fun. They're out there putting them into service, and we don't have a lot of empirical design or proven practice to support that. Our outreach toolbox is growing. Do we have legislator buy-in? Do they even have information on roundabouts, how to drive them? And many will not admit that they don't know much about roundabouts. Do we have successes to point to, and are we celebrating that success? And what are we doing about not so successful sites? Or in the East, as anyone who's lived there would know, what are we doing with unconventional traffic circles to send a consistent message to the public that, that's not a roundabout and they should be converted or eliminated? So after 20 years, we're still seeing barriers to implementing roundabouts. We know that funding is limited and there's a lot of safety improvement potential. Roundabouts represent change, and people don't like change. There's already enough in life. Incremental success hasn't worked. If the state of Wisconsin was to have relied on incremental success, then after 200 roundabouts, half of which are multi-lane, you'd think they'd be the poster child of roundabouts in the nation. But because they didn't work so hard at education and do multiple campaigns, they didn't achieve all of the success in public acceptance they hoped to. And it's been slow. We're certainly turning that around with some recent campaigns, but once the damage is done, it's difficult to repair it. We don't have systematic, robust implementation plans. A lot of us and the agencies we work with, see something like a roundabout or a DDI or some innovative intersection, and we immediately want to give it a try. And what we forget is that it might need some momentum and impetus in the form of political support and authority in order to advance something as innovative, that requires a change in the way people drive. And the user adaptation factor is higher than we bargained for. It's not impossible. It's not overly difficult. It's just sufficiently complex that we have to pay closer attention to what drivers need. We often get a lack of solidarity within departments of one or two agencies where, there might only be one champion starting the roundabout program, as there was in Vermont. I think his name is Tony Reddington. And Tony was the lone voice back in the late 90s trying to advance roundabouts. And others from other agencies in Michigan and in Kansas and in Wisconsin for sure, one champion does not make agency-wide acceptance. Too many agencies were reacting instead of planning. So they throw a couple of roundabouts on the ground and then they'd have problems with public acceptance, and they'd say, well, we'll get it right the next time. but already some of that resistance is being added to the public sentiment, and eventually it reaches a point where they'll introduce legislation to stop the program, and that's happening in a number of agencies. And so part of this session is to campaign against that so you don't have to go through it. And outreach focuses on projects and not a program. If a roundabout is a tool in the toolbox, it has to be delivered agency-wide, community-wide, nationwide. That means federal highways should be doing commercials on roundabouts on the television, just like they do drunk driving commercials. Because we can probably save almost as many lives by reducing intersection crashes using roundabouts as we can in campaigning against drunk driving. When you consider about 8,000 people a year die at intersections on U.S. highways, or on roads in the U.S., you know, even if we have a 50% crash modification factor for roundabouts, even a 25% crash modification factor, that's, you know, a quarter of the 8,000 people. That's 2,000 a year. Lives could be saved. So we need to see campaigns at that level in order to get the support for local agencies. They've heard me say this. I've told them that. So what's a good strategic implementation plan? Now we're way above the project level. This is before you even go to the design or the planning or the entertainment of a roundabout as an option. It's important not to isolate roundabouts. We've learned that that's like painting a target on something. It needs to be positioned in the toolbox of innovative intersections and interchanges. Well, before DDIs came along and we were doing roundabouts a long time ago, you know, we didn't have DDIs, we didn't have innovative intersections. So they were kind of standing on their own. But there's no reason to do that anymore. If you're going to use roundabouts, you know, set up a committee and don't just call it a roundabout committee. But do develop an innovative intersections team, and that team needs funding and it needs support. It needs project level support, but it needs a higher level support from councils, commissions, and departments. They need funding. They need funding for outreach. They need funding for skill development. They need funding for campaigns to convince their own peers as well as the public that the roundabout's a beneficial solution. Consensus needs to be built top-down. Legislators need to be better informed. It's not enough to happen to send a public meeting notice to them and saying, you know, we're having a public meeting on roundabouts, you're welcome to show up. I've seen too many times where the legislator walks in the room, whether it's a councilor, commissioner, or even a state representative, and they won't admit they don't know what's going on. They have no talking points, they have no history on the roundabout, and they're being asked to support it. So that won't happen at one of my public meetings. We'll make sure that they have all this information ahead of time. Not only that, we want them to tell us that they're in support of it. Because we've seen councilors come to meetings, you know, legislators will come to meetings, and they'll side with their constituents. And if the constituents don't like it, you can see where that goes. So we need to have authority to do what we're doing. That's another thing that's missing in the roundabout revolution is agencies have not, the staff at agencies have not developed the authority to do this. If it's just you and me as engineers, and we go out and do one of these public meetings and say, we think this is a good idea, what authority do we have? But if a mayor shows up, and the mayor announces that he's met with staff, you know, and if I'm working for a Department of Transportation and we meet with the local officials, then we bring the local officials to the meeting. They say that they've met with us, they've asked us all the tough questions, and then they tell the audience that they're in support of the roundabout. It's really tough to divide and conquer at that point. So that top-down consensus building is absolutely vital to your public outreach. So Tom, if you haven't gone and talked to the legislators about roundabouts and convinced them or had them support you with the idea, and you're really going to the public meeting process without the assurance that you have the authority to do what you're doing. Now, it might be budgeted, it might be in a roundabout design guide, but that doesn't mean that you'll get all the support you need to advance the project. And then the development of consensus happens inside out. It needs to happen within your own department, and it has to move from there to the police, fire, ambulance, maintenance folks, traffic operations, and then ultimately out to the public. And I'll show you kind of a flow chart a little later on. Some of this is, you think, well, it's common sense. That's not too hard to imagine that that's good. But stitching all this together and doing it, making it look like you planned it this way, just doesn't happen often enough. So we just don't see enough evidence of it, and we look all over the U.S. for this kind of thing. Count on repeated campaigns. One campaign is not enough. You know, one-time distribution of an outreach brochure or a flyer at a state level in the license plate renewal. You know, when so many license tags get renewed every year, you send out a brochure. If you do that one time, that's not enough. I know a state that tried that. It didn't work, because afterwards they, you know, initiate another 100 roundabouts, and by the time that second 100 roundabouts were installed, they were meeting some serious resistance. So you have to go at it several times and use different media: website, tweets, television, you know, public outreach at the project level, community centers, seniors groups. You know, go to the people of influence, the freight group. We'll talk a lot about the freight group. In the public outreach at a project level, you know, make the campaign match the audience, and appropriately timed, it can be very effective. I'll say more about that later. This is very important. If there's a storm cloud in, you know, near Fairbanks in the form of a roundabout that's poorly operating, you've got to go out and address that before you can get goodwill to do the next one. So you have to keep an eye out for those kinds of problem roundabouts and be prepared to address them. Even if you don't have the funding, tell them what you're prepared to do when you do get the funding, so people have the assurance that your program is connected and coordinated. Update the driver's manuals and tests. Some agencies, some states do have it in their driving manual. And students are tested, if not in the written test, then they're in the field. They go out to drive a roundabout as part of their test. And make sure they drive a multi-lane so they can be tested on whether to pick the correct lane when they enter. Overcome funding obstacles. Federal Highways has adequate monies in safety programs to fund up to 100% of the project cost. Encourage roundabouts at the lower tier agencies. If you work for Alaska Department of Highways or Transportation, like some agencies, they have taken it upon themselves to fund reviews and to provide peer review support, a peer-to-peer type arrangement. The state of Iowa uses safety money to educate lower tier agencies, municipalities on roundabouts, and they also provide peer review services. So we're under contract with Iowa. Whenever a local agency feels the need to have a peer review, they call up the DOT, and the DOT invites us in, and for anywhere from 3 to 30 hours, we'll peer review their designs and keep them out of trouble. Publicize your success. That's part of the campaign of roundabouts. Let people know you've had success installing the roundabout. That means you're collecting before and after data. You know, you're conducting research. You're working with the university to, you know, monitor and update roundabouts as you go, and keep the public informed of that. The state of Wisconsin did a study before and after of roundabouts and failed to publicize that they were achieving a 50% injury reduction in conversions. That's gold. That kind of information can be very helpful in building that equation between change and benefit. And of course the freight industry. And I liked your suggestion, Nathan, about bringing in the champions from those other segments of the community, especially the freight folks. They're well connected and influential. Minnesota's experience with freight was not good a few years ago. They had draft legislation to stop roundabout program. Oregon did stop the roundabout program because of the freight lobby. They restarted it about 18 months after this initial stall, and they started it back up on the condition that they would have closer coordination and consultation with the freight industry. And a similar experience in Minnesota. So those two states are now very proactive in engaging freight. So repeat steps 2 to 8 for the next 5 years. So 2 to 8. Develop an innovative intersections team, build a consensus, build it inside out, top down, repeat campaigns, vary the audience, the tools, and the timing, solve problematic roundabouts, update driver's manuals, and just keep doing that over and over again. Once is not enough. Because programs experience an evolution. You go through resistance, success, and resistance over time. You do something more complicated, you get resistance. And we've seen the gap between love them and hate them, like and dislike, widen in the past 5 years. Wisconsin did a survey of the Highway Department's success in operations, in planning and safety, general public impressions on how well the department's doing. And there was a roundabout question mixed in there, and the response was a very wide. I think something like 18% very much dislike roundabouts, and somewhere in 20% very much like them, and some shallow neutral ground. And it used to be people would say, well, I'll give that a try, but now it's either love them or hate them. And the reason that gap is widening is because we're missing a segment of the population, and we're overlooking the agency-wide type of outreach. So even though statistics show favorable safety improvement, the change drivers need to make is significant. And as engineers, when we do public outreach, we need to empathize that the change is necessary, but the change is worth it. Multiple campaigns. Engage the freight industry. This is what Oregon did not do so well. Their program was put on hold. They had draft legislation in Minnesota, but it was killed. Wisconsin had draft legislation, and it was killed. They were just at that 11th hour when they proactively reached out to the freight industry, including those with oversized vehicles, and knowing how well connected that group is and how influential they are. It was a just-in-time engagement with those stakeholders. And so they moved to mapping the oversized overweight routes and the advanced consultation with goods movers at a project level as well as at a state level through associations, similar to what Nathan had described in Vermont. Some of those champions came out to meetings to help solve some of the tougher outreach and consultation meetings. I want to take a little bit of time to focus on steps 2 and 3, which is, I think, drilling down to the level where we can have some influence at the project level and just above it at the agency level, and show you some examples of some of the tools and some of the strategies. And then I'll move through a couple of case studies that reinforce the need for education, and that'll pretty much wrap it up. But at this point, I'd like to stop. We're about 20-25 minutes into our session, and just get some reactions, thoughts, agreement.
I just know we had a project here, DOT did, that a local city council person kind of led the charge against. It wasn't a roundabout or anything, but he definitely swayed public opinion and got the project severely changed. You know, I wasn't good.
What would you do differently if you were the project champion?
I probably would have got fired. Hearing some of the comments he made at public meetings, I think I would have not been able to hold my tongue.
But as you can see from this, there's ways to avoid this. You know.
Yeah. No, some of your strategies, and I mean, I wasn't involved in the process. This was just a DOT project and a different firm, but you saw a lot of articles in the newspapers, so I don't know exactly what they did.
It's not a large group of, really, they're not just the stakeholders, they're our masters. And if they're not on board with it, and they don't understand it, or they can't be your champion, then you're really pretty much on your own. I had a public meeting, well, I won't say where it was. I had a public meeting that we went to, and we were loaded with a robust toolbox. We had all the tools, brochures, videos, animations, photos, examples of sites, success stories, and we actually never got to speak. You know, I had the microphone in my hands, but by that time the meeting was, I was supposed to get up and now I'm going to present on details of roundabouts, and I never got to speak because the counselor was in the room, but he wouldn't announce his presence, and we knew this. We could kind of see there was going to be challenges. So at the staff level, myself, my counterpart at the agency, and I think the agency's manager, you know, we plotted our course, and our strategy was to, you know, stage an open house and bring the roundabout plans in and show them, you know, how the design would fit the intersection, and we told them we'd educate them on how roundabouts operate and their benefits and so on. But we didn't have that higher level support going into the meeting. So I no longer go to a meeting unless I'm sure that the agency has unanimous, not necessarily unanimous, but a majority support from council or commission or department in support of the idea of using the roundabout, and not just at that location, but agency-wide. If it's not supported agency-wide, then you put yourself or your project at risk at the project level, because you're really taking a chance to try to prove two things at one time. One, that the roundabout's a good solution for the intersection in question, and two, that the roundabout's good for the agency. And that's asking a lot of the public. And often they'll say, no, we don't like roundabouts to begin with, so you should definitely not be proposing one here. So you try to do two things at once. So a two-step approach is to try and deal with, you know, the commission and the people in authority who give you the permission and authority to do these projects. You need to get to the Fed first and make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. You think after 10 years of doing roundabouts, or 15 in some states, that it would be a simple thing. It's not. It's turning out not to be, surprisingly. It's a thing we overlook. So I want to focus on these two steps, which is essentially, you know, kind of an agency-wide approach and then a project-level approach. And we'll break after this next eight or so slides.
Mark, we got a question in the room.
Yeah, please.
So you've explained about contacting the legislators and stuff, but why do you also want to contact the state police departments and emergency services as well? What benefit is that giving at the public meetings?
Well, two benefits. One, if it's a multi-lane roundabout, we can't take for granted that the police know how to cite a driver making an incorrect lane change or failing to yield at entry or having an exit crash. And I've seen too much evidence of this, and the police are sometimes not willing to admit they don't know how to govern traffic operations and good driver behavior at roundabouts. They don't have the information. And the second reason is they can be your champion. Someone in authority, you know, wearing a police uniform, can come to your public meeting and say, you know, I've been patrolling this area and drive through this intersection every day, and I've seen, you know, crashes at this intersection. You know, we need to do something. And I've got another intersection in my jurisdiction that was converted to a roundabout, and you know, we used to have fatal crashes there, and we don't have them anymore. So I think the roundabout's a good idea. So when a policeman steps up at your public meeting and does that for you, you don't have to do your job. You don't have to go and cite national statistics. It's come home. You have it. So you want those people to be your champions, and you want them to be well informed when they go out on the street and start to patrol and deal with drivers. This happened in an agency where they'd only had a few roundabouts installed, and at on the 6 o'clock news, the news reporter is interviewing the policeman, and the policeman is remarking how those people weren't stopping when they went into the roundabout. And roundabouts are yielded entry. You don't have to stop. Well, that ripple just about stalled their roundabout program for a couple of years. It was only through a lot of effort that staff could kind of reset the public expectation and understanding. But there was someone in authority who didn't understand how it works and telling people there's a problem with these things. Can you imagine? Same with EMS. They have to know how to get through and what to expect from drivers. So all these people, internal stakeholders like your traffic operations and maintenance people, they'll show up. If you're a DOT project proponent and you have a maintenance agreement with the local county to snow plow your roundabout, they come out to the public meeting and say, well, I don't know if that's going to work for us. We plow your roads, but we've never plowed roundabouts before. So we usually connect them with another maintenance operator. And that helps them get through it. So all those people are part of your team. If you try to do it alone, the results are not always predictable or satisfactory.
Mark, so Tim adds that roundabouts are also safer for first responders to navigate, so that it's inherently nice to have them be their champions as well. And it also reminds me that that's actually who there were two other champions that Vermont brought in, one of which was from the local fire department, and where they try to bring in the local fire departments as well as public safety, so either the state troopers or the local police enforcement. And so, if I remember correctly, the local police actually brought pictures from accidents at that particular intersection and said, "Look at how dangerous this is. You know, around help get rid of these types of accidents."
That's great. Yeah, that's the kind of thing you can count on them, and they're trying to do what you're trying to do, which is improve public safety. And if you work together, you multiply those efforts. So, this title of this slide is Roundabout Implementation Task Force, but it could well be Innovative Intersection Implementation Task Force. Anything that falls into the category of innovative or unusual, whether it's a flashing yellow arrow, or a DDI, or J-turn, or a roundabout, you form an ad hoc committee. And this is where, at a state level, which this chart kind of shows a combination state and agency level, that you have different departments, or different parts of the agency are represented as either ad hoc attendees or permanent attendees. So the level of participation in the right-hand column is periodic in some cases or permanent in other cases, with the engineers being involved from start to finish. But communications and outreach is a periodic thing. But all these people at some point need to meet and decide that they're going to do this thing, they're going to use roundabouts, and these are all the hot button items they have to address. There are legal implications, they have to pass ordinances for one-way circulation in an intersection. Most agencies haven't done that. They have to deal with questions of how to maintain and whether different equipment is required. Obviously, design and planning. They have to communicate their intentions to the public and do it in a way, in a coordinated way, that you get the word out long before the first one is open. The various activities that these champions undertake, and all of it comes under the authority of someone who is, whether it's a commissioner or a secretary of transportation or the mayor or the city manager, that you have them informed and let them lead part of the way, and let them be informed sufficiently so that they know where the pitfalls are. And when we look at some of the case studies, I'll show you the kinds of things that they're not aware of that they should be aware of. So help them with policy approved at the top, and look at all the barriers to advancing into progress. You need funding. It needs support. If you're going to advance the program, the project level funding is not enough to do an agency-wide campaign. And all the more reason then to bring it up to some of the senior staff and elected officials, because you need agency-wide campaigns to get things going. And it's not too late for agencies that have 50 roundabouts on the ground to start this now and to form this committee, and your work will be fast and efficient, but it has to be deliberate and focused at this point. If the next 50 roundabouts aren't, if there's no education and they're not supported, you could run into some big problems with public acceptance. And that translates into crashes, it translates into resistance, and ultimately to problems with advancing in any additional roundabouts. Strange that that hasn't happened in Europe or in Australia, but I think roundabouts were introduced here at a time when driver behavior is changing, and we tend to be a little more autonomous about our activity and behavior on roadways, and less accountable as we used to be, certainly in Europe, particularly in England and Britain. Accountability is very big. Driving is a privilege. Driver training and testing is rigorous, and the accountability factor weighs very heavy. So they tend to drive roundabouts better than we do. You need to monitor sites, and that's what committees will do. They'll set aside funds. The state of Wisconsin has funding set aside to monitor roundabout sites and to commission studies from the university to research and follow up and recommend, whether it's software or crash modification factors and safety performance functions, or even policy level. It could become essential, and you don't want to have to do that with a backwards glance. You want to be proactive instead of having to report and answer to committee for why roundabouts are getting resistance. You want to say, we've done these sites and look at the positive. So then it's a good news story, not backpedaling. Develop a public information toolbox, looking at the format of the meetings. I'll go through some of these, the tools and the people who should be there. And that strategic consensus building is going to get you momentum. Repeated campaigns. One outreach campaign is not enough. Publicize success. Folks don't believe statistics from other countries. The data has to be local. We learned that here in Wisconsin and Georgia and other states. They want to see that roundabouts are working in Georgia or Minnesota before they'll accept them in their next door to them in another roadway or intersection. Before and after studies with their effectiveness, and that happened to be within Pennsylvania that were getting resistance because they didn't have homegrown statistics. And economic development success is a real win-win, because you can show the business community is benefiting from the use of roundabouts. So those are, not just crash statistics, but economic development opportunity and benefits. So in an area-wide toolbox, and these are the kinds of things that can go onto websites: testimonials, case studies, how to drive videos, web cameras, driver training, website, brochures, all that kind of thing. Let me just show you something that one of my staff sent me this morning he was working on. And we developed a website called Roundabout Resources. And this is set up for Virginia DOT. It's an animation. It's done in Flash. And you can pick any turning movement. Let's pick the car making the left turn. Some instructions. There comes our vehicle. He's in the left. Oh, he has to get into the left lane. Pavement markings show what lane to choose. Yield to all traffic. Don't enter beside a driver in the roundabout. Stay in your lane. Signal right to exit. Yield to pedestrians. So they can be fairly sophisticated. I'm just going to look at what other resources we have. And these flash animations can be customized to different layouts of a roundabout: 5 legs, 4 legs, 2-lane entries, single lanes, bypass lanes. I'll maybe stop and just look at a couple of these things. So these tools, oh, I don't have the password. We have a virtual public meeting. And it's essentially the same thing you would do in a public meeting. It's just all done virtually. And I'll show you in a minute some of the brochures. Turn by turn, lane choice, trucks, school buses, emergency vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists, general information on acceptance. And this stuff, you know, this material has to be well crafted and easy to read. You know, designing it as though an engineer is going to read is not good. You know, it has to be done simply so the average motorist can look at the simple turning movements, right lane, right turns and throughs, and left lane, U-turns, lefts and throughs. Always obey the signs. Just a simple message, turn by turn. Some of the things that websites can have as well is, let's see if I can find it here. Some visualizations, and I think all of you have seen these. It flips to YouTube. And these are helpful at the public meeting as well as agency-wide to help people understand how roundabouts work. When they're complicated, like at an interchange.
Mark, Paul mentioned this is a bit of an aside, but your thoughts on signaling in a roundabout, since you were just mentioning it.
Yeah, I thought that question might come up because a lot of agencies don't insist on it. It's a very common thing in Europe, Australia. A couple of states have talked about signaling as you exit and making it part of the rules of the road. I think it's more a courtesy, and it seems to help drivers, particularly in multi-lane. They can see what the driver's about to do, and you'll get different opinions in our roundabout design community as to what's acceptable and what should be prescribed. I think it helps make the driver driving a roundabout more aware of their actions instead of being rather casual about entering and exiting. It gets them to focus on the driving task because they have to turn signal to enter. And if they're making a left turn and it's a multi-lane, they can stay in the left lane, but as they exit, they sometimes cross over the lanes, and it's good to signal so the downstream entry can see what they're doing. Yeah, these animations aren't coming up. It could be just the speed of the internet with all that's going on.
Mark, Charles follows up with how do you exit a roundabout from the inner lane if there's a car next to you in the outer lane? And I presume that he means in that outer lane the car is continuing to circle.
Right.
Shouldn't happen if you use a road mark.
Let's see if I can bring this animation back up. Well, that's not a multi-lane, that's a single lane. Let's go back to the one we had. So a two-lane entry, driver's in the inside lane, driver beside them. You're staying both exiting simultaneously. I'm not sure I understood the question.
So, Mark, I think what Charles is asking is in the situation where you've got somebody who's on the inside lane of a two-lane roundabout that wants to exit, and the person in that outer lane would either be making a through, is in the outer lane but would be making a through, and is effectively blocking that person in the inner lane from exiting.
Well, if both drivers can make a through movement, then there should be two lanes corresponding on the exit. Unless the inside lane is a left only, then there could be a single lane exiting. But roundabouts have to adhere to the rules of lane continuity. If there's two through lanes marked and physically present on the approach, then there have to be two lanes circulating and two lanes exiting. The only time we'll see a condition where, see if I can some of these others. I'm not sure this one's going to come up, but it's a five-leg that has not only consecutive lefts, but here it is, the idea that there might be a two-lane entry and a single-lane exit. This was for a site in Texas when I was Ourston a couple of years ago. We merged into GHD. And you can see that with the use of the spiral, that there can be a driver in the right lane. That's actually a right only. And the left lane can go through and exit or around and exit one of the other legs. Two-lane entries from one leg can feed to two lanes circulating and two lanes exiting. But it's really important that the driver in the right lane not try to make a left turn, and the markings help to reinforce that.
Yeah, I think what Charles was getting at, Mark, is like someone who inappropriately is making either a left or a through movement, if we're talking about a four-lane roundabout, and inappropriately chooses that outside lane. And it happened quite often. Like I grew up close to Augusta, Maine, which has two, they used to be both quote-unquote rotaries, but it would happen all the time. Somebody would be in that outside lane continuing through, and somebody on the inside lane wanted to exit. Either that person on the inside lane is forced to circle around the roadway again, or they slam on the brakes and come to a stop and then try to accelerate their way out of the roundabout.
Okay.
That's the one, County Circle, Maine.
So this was an unconventional rotary or traffic circle with no pavement marking and striping. And what it did have in the way of marking was not uniform with approach lane designation and exit lane continuity. So in this case, you can see a left turn, left only, inside lane is going to exit either Stone or, I can't remember, that's Coney. And this is Memorial across the bridge, and these two lanes take them through. So the driver can't make a left from the right lane without crossing the lane line, and that's possible to do so, but they have to turn signal. This is a double left, so this driver came from the inside lane, and they're spiraling out. There's a spiral. This paint mark spirals them out to the exit. Now trucks do pretty much what they want. They're big. That's a common scene, is cars stopping in the entry for a truck. It's so difficult for them to start up, and once they get started, by that time 3 or 4 vehicles have come around. They had a gap when they began, and there is none after they entered. So the striping should be educational, but designs like this required a lot of community outreach. Good crash reduction. Chief of Police for Augusta City has observed a 50% reduction in crashes. And the congestion, it has gone down significantly. There's still some peak periods where it's congested, but for the most part, it's in pretty good shape. So there's a lot of education material. We'll talk a bit more about that. I'll just maybe leave that website up and running for now. So we were talking about the tools of public outreach. All these things can be posted to websites, and they can be reused at the public meeting. The brochures can be pulled off, printed, and distributed. You can prepare talking points, bulletins for elected officials, the kind of thing that precedes the meeting, so they know what to expect when they come to the meeting. Don't take that for granted. They won't admit it. This one's kind of novel, the idea of a safety village, but instead of teaching children how to cross at signals, as these safety villages do, is putting them in these little ATVs and getting them to go around the roundabout. This is actually the same intersection that's been converted to a roundabout. It happens to be in Canada. The other idea of an area-wide campaign is to make pedestrians more assertive. In our last session, we talked about pedestrian safety and the idea of being assertive. So the photo on the left is of a counselor, and all of the council was put on the bus, taken out to the 5 or 6 multi-lane roundabouts, and they were taught to cross, pointing their hand. And some of them tried to cross without pointing, and they couldn't get a gap. As soon as they raised their arm, things changed. over in Loveland, Colorado. They had a Look at Me and Look Smart campaign. So kids were learning, and this was not roundabouts, but just all crosswalks. So those kinds of area-wide campaigns are necessary. The things that you can put together, brochures, videos, content on websites. We work with the trucking community in this part of the world. The folks who represent Schneider Trucking helped us write the script for how to drive it as a truck driver. We use some of the language that they refer to, the concept of sight side. The driver has a sight side and a blind side. The sight side is looking out to the left out the window, and the blind side is the mirrors on the right. So they tend to drive, so they keep drivers, other cars, on their left. That means they make wide left turns. Or they cover the whole roadway and take both lanes. So we talked about lane discipline in the last. Common crashes. Yield to all lanes. So failure to yield is a common crash. And choosing the correct lane, is one of our attendees pointed out, is, you know, how do you know what to do when the driver beside you, you're unsure whether they're going to make a left from the right lane and you're about to exit. So let's look at the failure to yield problem, and I have a case study that talks a bit more about that. That's the driver entering, and it's common to see them crash in this configuration. On the two-lane entry, where the driver in the right lane is entering, the driver in the inside lane is exiting. And depending on who you talk to, some will say that the reports coming back from the police are that the driver at fault is commenting that he didn't think that the driver in the inside lane was going to exit. He thought he was going to turn left. And so the designation of lanes by marking seems to be misleading some drivers to believe that that means they're going to make a left turn. And that's not isolated. We've heard that all over in the U.S. anecdotally, in the state of Wisconsin, where the police actually, or the researchers actually looked at the crash reports. The police were noting that drivers were commenting they didn't think they needed to yield to the inside lane. Then there's the not so obvious left turn problem. And if they're driving side by side, that can be an issue. If they're not, it's usually a surprise, but there's no altercation or interaction between the cars. So there's brochures on how to deal with that issue. Failure to yield, as well as choosing the correct lane before you enter the roundabout, not having to make that choice partway through. So turn-by-turn instructions. Emergency responders and how drivers should behave. You know, they should exit the roundabout and pull to the right, let the ambulance go through. The ambulance driver should anticipate that that's how they're going to do it. So there's some education, really, not just for the responders, but the rest of us. Once we've got some of that area-wide outreach and the campaign is underway and things are on the website and we're ready to go, we want to start by developing the project components early. So Tom was gracious to share his upcoming experiences, and so you can ask questions about how well informed the legislators are, how well informed the rest of the department is, you know, who's the champion, how many champions can you bring with you. Publicizing the problem at the intersection, whether it's congestion or safety, is important to do that continuously throughout the outreach process. The first meeting and the last meeting before construction and after construction. So you can remind people of what would have happened with the alternative control and what would have happened without any change in control. Have lots of tools, general tools, area-wide type tools, and then project-specific. Remember the storm cells? Poorly operating roundabouts need to be addressed before you go to the next meeting. Otherwise, they dump on you for the last roundabout and don't let you do the next one. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. So the tactical level, project level outreach is about matching the audience, the tools, and the timing. So there's certain tools, these are the tools across the top, everything from brochures to animations to public handouts to television spots and newspaper press releases. Each of these has a proper place and a proper time. And so if we start with the audience of elected officials who need to be informed to give us the authority to do this, then we put certain information in their hands. And then you begin to build momentum top down through the media, because they'll print news if you don't give it to them, and down into the, we call them tier 1, 2, and 3. And general public is the last audience to be reached. Everyone else has to be engaged before that. That's a very effective top-down and internal to external approach. Here's your project-specific tools that you bring to the meeting: exhibits, videos, animations, brochures, how-to, crash exhibits, what types of crashes can occur, some statistics from the Insurance Institute, and videos from them, things that give you kind of area-wide or statewide benefits of roundabouts based on publicized before and after studies, how to use a roundabout, flash animations and visualizations. Your toolbox is full if you've got all these ready to go. But without the authority to do what you're doing and the support and momentum, and we've gone to meetings with all of this and still failed. So we said it wasn't for lack of information that we didn't get to where we were going. So use better visuals and animations. This is a photo rendering of a future intersection with 3-lane entries in Fort Worth, Texas. Big roundabout plan. You're concerned about pedestrians, and they should be. 3-lane entries. It's tough to cross. Use a scale model. This just happens to correspond to scale model cars and trucks that fit the railroad scale of HO model railroad, 187. And we plot it in paper or vinyl. And then we have the ability to actually see the space of the scale model within the roundabout. That has helped our truck driving community so much. We don't go to a meeting without one of these. And we even went to the trouble to design and fabricate a wind turbine showing the oversized vehicle and how it's going to track, inside and outside. The in-field driver training before your roundabout opens. Use cones, use flagmen, hand out brochures through the window, get people to learn how to drive it, before you cut the ribbon, and continue with enforcement and encouragement afterwards. This was a project in Dallas. We took the 2-lane entry down to a single lane on the approach and then let it widen out. Gave the brochures out through the windows on all 5 legs, and then the driver basically had a laboratory to enter which lane they felt was the correct one, reading the signs, looking at the brochure. It caused a bit of congestion, but 400 roundabout brochures later, people are coming back and saying, I need to give one to a family member. So it caught on very well. And then have a grand opening, celebrate your success, and make sure the cake is round. On to a case study. I'll stop at that point. Nathan will take comments and questions. Big session on public outreach.
Sure thing. Any questions?
All right. There was a lot of talk about the whole left turn and right turn. Who yields in that situation? If a person on the inside lane is trying to make a right turn out of the intersection and there's a person immediately to their right, are you supposed to yield to the person on your right and wait till they pass and then go? Or is the person on your right supposed to yield to you as you exit? That may not have made any sense.
It did. The driver in the circle, whether or not there's lane markings, the driver in the circle has the right of way. Doesn't matter whether the driver in the circle is on the inside or the outside lane. The driver entering has to yield to circulating traffic.
Can you go forward 2 slides?
So that's a failure to yield. It's probably
How about the case after that, though?
Yeah. So in this circumstance, the driver entering has to yield, but in this one, they're both already circulating.
Well, it's an incorrect lane change, isn't it? And it's also choosing the incorrect lane to make a movement. So the driver is not in the leftmost lane or in the left-hand side of the roadway in order to make a left turn.
Okay. So in entering a 2-lane, sorry, go ahead.
even if the driver, even if there were no striping in the circle, and there were proper lane designation on the approach with black and white, the policeman would have reason to give the driver in the red path a ticket, probably $100, and 3 points for an incorrect lane choice and failing to yield. Because the driver
on the yellow path is okay.
has the right of way to exit, and if they collide with the driver circulating and wanting to make a left, then the driver circulating and making a left is at fault.
Okay, so in a two-lane roundabout like this, the right-hand approach lane is meant for a right turn, and the left hand is meant for a through or a left?
No, both lanes can make a through movement. You see this red vehicle can make a through movement. From the upstream condition, there's through arrows, and there's a left turn arrow on the left lane and a right turn arrow on the right lane.
Okay, all right, it makes sense now. I got it.
Yeah, so these fancy markings are not so easy to understand for drivers, but see 2 through lanes, left and the left, 2 exit lanes, and a right turn. So in one of our brochures, there it is. So the blue path, right and through, yellow is through, left and U-turn. And these black and white signs are then essential, because if the driver does make the left from the right lane, the policeman has every reason to cite them. So sometimes we use them overhead. Sometimes ground mounted on the lateral on the right hand side. If there's a median that's wide enough, put them on both sides. Okay, I'll take you through a couple of case studies that address these very issues. So Wisconsin, and this ties back into the roundabout campaign. So they've got a couple hundred roundabouts, lots of multi-lane. They started the safety study back in 2007 when there was already about 100 on the system. Looked at some 3 to 4 years of crash data before and after. And they're in the current phase right now, and I'll step you through the study and what it's revealing. As of 2008, they had 40 roundabouts within the DOT, and 30 were included in the evaluation. So 6 years ago, that was doubling almost every year. They're over 200 now. In the 3 and 4 years data before and after, they used empirical Bayes. They also used a simple before and after analysis for comparison. They saw a significant decrease in high severity injury type crashes, but an increase in low severity crashes, particularly on the multi-lane. Number of roundabouts studied, 50% reduction in severe, 9% decrease in total crashes. By 2013, a 12% increase. So more roundabouts on the system, and property damage crashes are going up. In multi-lane, they're not going up a little bit. And total crashes in single lane are still going down. So that's a little frustrating, because we thought roundabouts were all about safety. Property damage doesn't imply personal safety, an issue with personal safety, but it does bring up the question of property safety and security, the sense of safety.
Mark, does property damage, does that also include like people taking out signs like at the roundabout? Yes. Like, I presume that's included.
Yeah, single vehicle crashes, anything that's reportable. These are reportable collisions, so there's likely other single vehicle, especially with alcohol involvement, where they end up in the central island and they find a friend who can get them out of trouble before the police show up. Decrease in crash severity, no fatals. Some sites with a slight increase in injury crashes. Overall decrease in fatal and injuries. Some sites with no change, 17 locations where they increased from 1 to 3 crashes. Overall 12% increase. In the final phase, they're going to look at the roundabouts built in those years before and add that to the data set in the phase 2 to make the study a little more comprehensive. And examining roundabouts in those latter 2 phases of study that did not perform as expected, and see if there's any contributing factors, any common variables, and then initiate a campaign. So look at the designs, look at what might be happening, but continue to educate at the same time. In the event that it's not design, but it's education, at least you cover off both. So the statewide campaign is going to use TV, radio. Some of this is already underway. Address the primary causes of low severity, which is failure to yield, side swipes, exit crashes with incorrect left turns. They produce this video that uses the concept of a record circulating, and you can see it on the Wisconsin DOT website. The commonalities between roundabouts that have safety concern, again, the failure to yield and the incorrect lane choice. They're the overrepresented crash patterns. And as we saw, there's the failure to yield, and the most common failure to yield is the right lane and the inside lane exiting, where the driver in the right lane should yield and wait just long enough. Let's see what that looks like. This is a Michigan video from a few years back. See if I can get it up here. Watch the failure to yield, right lane here, inside lane exiting. The van will pull up, and the car will circulate. So he's looking for a gap, and maybe he sees a little gap here and doesn't realize that that snowplow driver is going to exit. There's property damage, but frustrating and somewhat of a nuisance for all involved, and folks who have to have a little congestion to wait for the wrecks to clear. Little different illustration, roundabout Minnesota. I took this video and I wasn't there for 10 or 15 seconds and to watch a conflict pattern, and sure enough, common reoccurring problem. Courtesy on the part of the driver in the gray vehicle not to collide with the white minivan, but he had the right of way. So is it gap seeking? Is it driver adaptability? Is it incorrect perception because of the presence of lane lines? Is it all of the above? So we have to roll back some of these issues to figure out what's going on, because these problems aren't going away. Some possible solutions: better education, that can't hurt. Put tabs in the yield sign, yield to both lanes of traffic. There's one on the right. The word yield in the entry area. Restricting sight. I have a case study I want to show you from Madison. Sight to the left, restricting sight to the left. And removal of the circulatory roadway lane lines. I'd just like to take a straw poll. How many of you believe that this conflict would not occur if there was no lane lines in the circle? Nathan, take a vote. How many in the room think that that conflict would be eliminated if we remove this lane line?
Sure.
We've got Mark. One person says it would solve, make the problem better. We have two saying it would make the problem worse, not having lines. Not that you necessarily wouldn't correct that issue, but you'd have other problems arise by not having lane lines.
Well, then let's be specific. What problems would arise? Well,
just confusion between drivers. Is it a multi-lane roundabout or is it a single-lane roundabout?
Yeah, and I mean, in Alaska, people 8 months out of the year make their own lanes, and the the lanes are designated by the ridges of snow in between them, not by what the stripes are. So,
Sure.
I mean, not having stripes might actually not make a difference, depending.
Okay. What about the left turn? What about the left turning driver? If there's no paint in the circle. So let's take the comments. So if it's a two-lane approach designated and there's markings that show two through lanes, what makes this different from a signalized intersection with a left turn and other through or right lanes? In the upstream condition, what makes the designation of two lanes approaching not imply that it's going to be two lanes downstream? Isn't that what our human factors, our expectations would tell us? We only
Yeah, your expectations for a signalized intersection, yeah, but people who are unfamiliar with roundabouts are automatically going to assume that it's different.
Okay. So what if this was a two-lane entry and there was a lot of congestion and you didn't have circulating stripes downstream? Some would argue, well, it's going to become a single-lane roundabout. But if there's a quarter-mile queue, do you think that'll be a single-lane roundabout?
No.
No. No, it'll generate. It might not be side-by-side travel, though. Do you think drivers would be compelled to drive side-by-side if there weren't lane lines? Anyone?
Probably not. They'd probably be afraid of a vehicle on the inside swinging out wider or a vehicle on the outside swinging in and taking the turn sharper, just because they don't really have that invisible boundary of that line to sort of be their divider.
Okay.
People do tend to cut corners, and if there aren't lane lines on a two-lane roundabout, I think people might cut them too sharply.
Okay, so then our driver in the gray vehicle, his path would actually be across this lane line right up to the exit thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
His intent and his trajectory would be a different path than staying in lane discipline. And if there's no one wants to drive beside him, is that of consequence?
No, but if he did have someone beside him, he'd pinch them out if they're in his blind spot and he doesn't see them.
Right. But then the guy that's beside him or near him, is he going to trust that he'll stay in the same lane, or is he going to stay clear of him?
He'll probably hit his brakes.
Yeah. What I'm describing, at least challenging you on, is exactly how British roundabouts operate. Where roundabouts are the most prevalent and successful in the world, they didn't start out striping them like this. So there's something about not putting more that makes it better. We don't know for sure, but there's a couple of agencies that are testing this idea, and they've opened half a dozen or so, moderately trafficked two-lane roundabouts without circulating paint.
Yeah, I can see the merit to it, because if there are stripes on the ground, a driver's going to tend to stare at the stripes in order to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And if you're not perfectly familiar with what you're supposed to do in a roundabout like this, it might actually be more beneficial to watch the other drivers as opposed to figure out what the lines on the road mean, especially if 8 months out of the year you can't see the lines on the road.
Well, I need to bring you with me to all the public meetings, because that's what drivers should be doing all the time. There's not a lot of guidance afforded by this marking and paint when the driver should be looking for other vehicles and where they're positioning to exit. So speed, path, and direction, by the time you enter, if you haven't chosen the correct lane, this might help one of the drivers, but there's a false sense of security on the part of the inside lane that this driver can actually he might still make the left, but you're not going to expect him to do so. So
Charles said he remembers that in Britain, where they have tons of roundabouts, and similar to what you're saying, Mark, where they may or may not be striped, that he would move to the outer lane as he got close to the exit, rather than trying to exit from the inner lane.
Yeah, this driver would have spiraled. He would have begun to spiral to this outside lane and accelerate as he exits. And that trajectory, that body language between this driver and this driver would have resulted in this driver possibly hesitating another fraction of a second longer to see his path. Anyway, that's a thorny issue. You can see I have some ideas about it, but I also believe that striping is beneficial in some cases. In fact, essential. Let me show you a case where I think striping is essential. This is a web camera. It's live. You can get it to come up here. There we go. Can you see that?
Yep.
It's 4:27 in the afternoon on the East Coast. Once I make it, that's about 7 hours later than you. There's the queue on the approach. It's a double spiral design. It has to have lane discipline because of the wide circulatory roadway. And this one carries about 5,000 cars per hour in the PMP. So the essentials of these markings are very clear when you see that drivers have to make certain choices in lanes and spiral out to an exit with a single lane coming from a 2- and a 3-lane cross-section. Not having paint in this area would be a problem. You can see the correct lane choices. The odd driver will change lanes. Some approaches more or less congested depending on time of day. No small queues. That's just about the peak right there. You can see some exit blockage.
Paul asked if they would have striped this one in England.
This is how they would have striped it in Britain. So it's only some of the simpler designs that are receiving pavement marking or not receiving pavement marking. So we saw that failure to yield collision. We're working towards improved education where the driver in the right lane understands that they're at fault if they enter and circulate beside a driver in the inside lane exiting. So we see tabs on the signs, yield to all traffic from the left. From both lanes, to all lanes, to both lanes. Different treatments. This is the study on some failure to yield type collisions. The before condition for this roundabout location is a T intersection set up for a fourth leg of a realigned roadway coming through. Very large 2-lane roundabout, bypass lanes, one direction, partial bypass, all 3 other directions. Expandable to 3-lane entries. It opened maybe 4 years ago. Some crash evidence of a particular kind, failure to yield. What does it point to? Is it poor geometry marking signs? Is it education? Should there be more enforcement? A field review was necessary, and some conflict studies were undertaken to look at driver behavior. This is the crash pattern for 2011. mostly entry circulating collisions. Failure to yield. Driver entering, a lot of them in the left lane. Not all was mapped correctly, but on several approaches, but predominantly on this one. And we went out to the field to look at that site. 2012, similar pattern. An intersection not far from there, similar problem with failure to yield. Exacerbated, slightly higher frequency in the following year. Overrepresentation of entry circulating, failure to yield. Not just, approach speed issues, but just outright failure to yield. Looking at driver behavior, we discovered the site to the left is too generous. We don't have research to point to a correlation between entry circulating crashes and site to the left, but my hypothesis is that screening and restricting site to the left will help. And the early evidence from this site is indicating that worked. And of course, education enforcement can help. It's part of a good traffic engineering diet. The 3 E's of engineering, education, and enforcement. And the question about circulatory lane lines. We made a choice at this stage not to recommend changing the striping pattern, but just to work one variable at a time. You remember the failure to yield collision we looked at? That's what was occurring here, but at higher speeds. So drivers coming up the approach, and you can stand here, just upstream of the crosswalk and look at the drivers, and they're glancing and sighting, but they're making 2 glances. The first glance to the left is in about this position. The second one is around the crosswalk. So they turn their heads. You can record that on the clipboard. And about 1 in 10 drivers would only sight to the left once. They'd look left here and go all the way through without sighting to the left at the crosswalk. Now, if a vehicle appeared or they misjudged the path and speed of a vehicle in conflict, and they only looked once, there's a very good chance of a crash or at least a near miss. So the ideal site is really down to about this level. And in the British Roundabout Guide, they have sight to the left from 50 feet upstream to only the upstream entry. In our Federal Roundabout Guide, we have sight from the vehicle upstream in the fastest path through the roundabout to a driver from the left also in the fastest path through the roundabout, so it's just about the red line. And we've always felt that was excessive. When you compare it to the British Guide that's been in circulation for close to 30 years. And if it was a problem, you think they would have addressed it a long time ago. So you can see traffic all the way around the circle, coming in, entering, circulating. It's generous, and it seems to be a contributing factor. The landscaping wasn't very well developed at the time it was open. You can see there's just a lot of green, and it's all been grassed and sodded, and nothing really in the vertical dimension, maybe a little bit of mounding on the central island, but not much. So the addition of screening plantings here and a little bit more on the central island tend to restrict the site just sufficiently so that drivers could only look upstream to the entry point. My recommendation was a row of spruce trees, maybe a little tighter than this, and I suggested even that they use snow fence to start with just to prove the point, and they went ahead and did this without trying to do a test of any kind. So within days there were phone calls at the city of Madison saying, I can't see to the left, and the city's reply was, and that's a problem? So the crashes have been reduced in about a year or so after. They'll collect them a few more months or maybe another year's worth of data before they report. And so you can see from either direction that your site is intermittent at best. Left turns from the rightmost lane. Here's our conflict with the exiting driver. Regardless of what treatments are on the approach, some drivers will still elect to enter and make an incorrect left turn. And the kind of things that we see are typical of what's in this video. Oops, let's go back and Let me get that working for us here. You see the lane markings, 3 throughs left from the left lane. And there goes our FedEx truck's going to be late today. It's kind of like the pit maneuver. Let's see that again. So the white van had the right of way to exit. And the car in the left lane had crossed the lane markings either without signaling or just cut off the vehicle. Now this is a case where striping is pretty helpful because there's a lot of space there. And somehow that wasn't enough, even with the solid lines. Perhaps the driver waited till the solid lines opened up to a skip white and then they made their left, which would be, yeah, that would be kind of discouraging. You go to all the trouble to paint it and then the driver still makes the left when the lane lines open up. Solutions, again, more education, could be additional signing. We don't do a great job on approach signing for lane designation. Possibly additional circulatory marking, and in some cases on 2-lane roundabouts with fairly compact circles, you could remove the stripes and they would operate with a lane and a half or a little less capacity, but they'd likely work safer. And there's some education brochures that can help with that process. Use of overhead signs. This is common in some agencies. It's a fairly slender sign bridge, but it's still fairly costly. These are probably $50,000 to $80,000 a piece to install. Some definition, left and right lane, reinforced with regulatory. Sometimes in duplicate, left and right hand side. Pavement markings in duplicate stream. Reinforce that lane choice or incorrect lane choice. The site in Richfield, Minnesota that I took the video of where you were watching the 2 vehicles interact here when the circulating exiting, they chose to take the solid white and make it skip, and they chose to extend the solid white from the approach well up into the entry area and add a second group of lane markings. And they've seen a benefit in conflict and crash reduction, particularly for that left turn from the right lane. They realize once they're in that right lane and they see that second set of stripes, they're not going to make a left. And where this condition perhaps makes it a little more casual, this seems to have helped to reinforce it. Some additional markings. Madison had to put this on one of their other roundabouts. Doubled up on some of the lane choice. They were having double lefts actually occurring, lefts from the right lane, having collisions near the exit. They added this sign as well. Part of the problem was that this roundabout that I'm showing you the photo had a pattern of 2 lanes going from one leg to another. In other words, route continuity was habitual for everyone using this intersection previous to the roundabout. They all took 2 lanes and went up this other exit leg. So it wasn't until there was enforcement and just over time, people realized that this right lane can't make the left turn. So there were issues with just the habit forming that occurred prior to the roundabout being installed. So it wasn't a double left, it's a single left. So 2 throughs and okay. That brings us to the end of that material. I hope you found that informative. I had fun talking about it again, especially the public outreach. We've got a bit of time for questions, otherwise we're finishing a few minutes early today.
Any questions?
This isn't an outreach question, it's a design question. I wasn't here for that. But how do you handle super elevation in roundabouts?
Okay.
Are they sloped inward?
Particularly for trucks, we tend to go with the inward sloping halfway across the cross-section. Let's find a typical here. So this has become the common typical cross-section, and it tends to be associated with oversized, overweight vehicles because the flatbed or lowboy OSOW vehicle can snag on the apron. So the tendency is to go with a rolled crown, put a catch basin at the, tip the circle like a plate in the intersection area, rather gentle or not so abruptly tipped, and set a double catch basin at the low point, and then crown the circulatory roadway and drain it 1% away from the truck apron to keep a prominent central island, and then split the drainage. This is a 1/3, 2/3 configuration. If it's two lane circulating, I would put it at the crown point at the midway across the traveled way. So one lane is on one side of the crown and the other lane's on the other side of the crown. Some single lane roundabouts, they're still sloping 2% out, 2% all the way to the outside, but with trucks tipping and the potential for trucks snagging on the truck apron, this is an emerging preferred cross section.
All right, thank you. That answered my question.
Okay.
So Tim asked, with such a low speed, or says that with such a low speed in the roundabout, that he'd go with a normal crown, no super needed.
You would think so, but the thing with, maybe this isn't one of the better examples to show, but yeah, there's, we'll go back to that truck. One of the issues that's come out of British design practice is that, and I don't know if I have it in this set of slides. Well, one of the problems that develops on high-speed approaches is that the truck, if there's a series of reverse curves, the truck goes through the swaying, develops a swaying action, and making the left turn, we don't want to disadvantage the truck further by having adverse crossfall. So having the slope of the circulatory back to the central island and then outward, it produces kind of a rolled crown affair instead of, it's not a knife edge, it's just a parabolic, surface where in asphalt it's a flat crown essentially. So you don't get the effect of back and forth, and that seems to set up better for trucks entering and circulating. In the British Roundabout Guide, they've used the rolled crown for, again, close to 30 years. That the guide's gone into 2 publications, and on separate occasions they've reinforced that that's good design practice. It seems to mitigate some of the rollover potential. If it's done correctly, it's very subtle and almost undetectable. See if I can show you a roundabout video with some, no, this is just not going to cooperate. Sorry about that. I thought I could move it ahead, skip the logos. This is a site around Madison. It's easy to take video when you can do it on your way home. This one has rolled crown. So it has a spiral design because it has double lefts. Somewhere near the end of the video, you'll see a truck come through. So in terms of lane continuity, the inside left is left only, and the outside is exiting. So from 2 lanes to 1, the approach markings are essential. Otherwise, drivers will cut across this lane line and try to exit and cut someone off in the outside lane. Not too busy at that time of day, but in the rush hour, this fills up. There's industrial uses, lots of trucks. Very compact roundabout, so the trucks cannot stay in lane. There's a Walmart Supercenter over to the right behind this one building, and the roundabout was an improvement paid for by by the Walmart. There's an interchange just to the horizon side of the video, and there's a truck that's just coming down now. And I think he's going to make a left turn, so you can see the swept path. And I don't believe he uses the apron, or if he does, he just cuts the edge of it. Straddling the lane. Yeah, making the left. So he just catches the apron. Still lots of room on the right. He could have, but there's no way he could have maintained lane discipline, and he exited in the right lane. So the correct left for this driver would have been all the way to the outside. So there's a rolled crown. You can see that vehicle's tipping one way and not so much the other way. Let me show you what happens with I'll let that play for a second here. Let me turn off the sound. This is up in the north end of Phoenix, and this is crown, an uncrowned circulatory roadway. It's 2% sloped all the way out to the outside. There's something else. This one also has a rolled crown, and it has a heavy percentage of trucks. I showed this one the other day. I think it was in the case 1 category, where the trucks tend not to be able to stay in lane except maybe a WD-40 or 50, but the larger vehicles are overtracting. And so the inside lane is actually sloped back. It's very difficult to tell because the whole circle is tipped. So the low point is just about where my cursor is. You can see it here a little better. There's just a little bit of favoring of that inside vehicle track, so it's not all sloping to the outside, and it kind of keeps the load a little more upright. I think you get the idea. Other questions?
It's looking pretty quiet, Mark.
Okay. Well, school's out early today.
Sounds good.
Look for an email with the software download codes. For those of you who are going to sit in next Friday, we're going to do some software demonstration where I'll walk you through the Arcady model, showing you both the Arcady, which has its basis in Britain, and the HCM model that's built into Arcady for U.S. roundabouts, or roundabouts with U.S. research backing. And next Wednesday we'll do an introductory on capacity issues and research, and then Friday will be a demonstration. So the download code, essentially it'll be an email that directs you to the Transport Research Laboratory website, and you click on the link, it downloads an exe file, and then you execute the file, load it on the laptop or something you can bring with you next Friday. it generates an unlock code, which you have to email back to TRL, and they email back the unlock code to you. So it's a bit of a stepwise process. If you don't follow the instructions just carefully, it can be a problem. So that will give you a 3-week license, full access to a full use of the software for 3 weeks. We call it an education license, and I tell them the University of Alaska Fairbanks is doing a workshop on roundabouts. You can send this link to anyone, Nathan, and they can play with the software for a few weeks. And there's an excellent help manual. It even describes a lot of the research behind roundabouts. There's a very good tour through the software. There's a wizard that step by step walks you through it. So by the time we have it next Friday, if you have a couple of days to play with it off and on, then you'll be ready to work with it on Friday, and you can play with it while I'm playing with it. I'll show you some things that the software can do that are kind of unusual that some of the other packages in North America can't do. And that should be an interesting session. So I'll try and get that link out to you. It'll likely be Monday morning, Monday afternoon, because TRL is UK time and they've gone home for the weekend.
All right. Well, that sounds good, Mark.
Thanks, Owen. Yeah, happy to receive any comments that you can get, Nathan, from if there's anything I can do differently in either the presentation style or the pace in which I speak. Let Nathan know and I'll pass it along.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, we'll wrap it up, and we hope you stick with us for next week. So we'll see you back here Wednesday, same time, same channel.
Thanks.
Thanks. Have a good weekend.